I just wanted to say hello to everybody. We are very pleased that you're with us and that you are really devoting your time to make the efforts to help people who are suffering from this major tragedy in Ukraine. And I'm very, very pleased that tonight we've got with us Michael Duffy, who is a wonderful worldwide expert in trauma, working with trauma, in CBT, doing therapy with trauma, and really thinking about system support in these traumatic situations. So I hope he will be sharing with us all his experience, well, some of his experience with dealing with these drastic issues. Thank you very much, Michael, for joining us. And we are pleased to have you here.
Thank you, and it's my pleasure to be here. My colleagues and I want to extend our deepest support for what you're doing. We have worked with trauma during conflict for 30 years, and so we have an understanding of what it's like trying to respond to the mental health needs of a population that has been traumatized. So you have our support and our solidarity with what you are doing. I want to share with you some of our experiences and what we have learned from working with trauma in Northern Ireland. I lead the university's trauma research group, and I'm also the clinical advisor and the research advisor to Northern Ireland's trauma network. And so I want to talk you through some of what we've learned from Northern Ireland, particularly around what the predictors of PTSD seem to be, and how, in order that we can respond with early interventions to try and help people at an early stage. A lot of our work has been applying trauma-focused CBT with victims of the conflict in Northern Ireland. And in more recent years, we have been developing a model for working with more complex and traumatic grief reactions. And so in terms of the context of our research, it's slightly different to your situation because our conflict lasted for a long time. And we certainly hope that the current conflict in your country, in Ukraine and in Eastern Europe, will not last a long time. And I suppose one of the, because the conflict here lasted a long time, it gave us the opportunity to try to understand how conflict impacts on people's mental health and how we can try to treat trauma-related mental health problems more effectively. And these are some of the scenes from the early days when the conflict started in 1969, when there were riots in the street, and those protests were put down by the forces of the government at that stage in Northern Ireland. Then we had terrorist and paramilitary groups that developed, and their activity was planting bombs in the center of our towns and cities. And there were all sorts of killings by gunfire. And there were huge amounts of street protests. And that lasted for over 3 decades. We also had lots of intergroup violence. So children in this set of pictures were prevented from going to a school in their area because they had to pass a community that represented the other side of the population. And this is something that can happen in conflict zones where people fall into particular camps, and very quickly they develop this group think mechanism where everybody in the other group is perceived to be bad and everybody in our group is perceived to be good. And these group processes influence how people process their trauma as well. So it's something to be mindful of, that when you're working with individuals and families over the next period of time, that how their group responds to the conflict can have a bearing on how they process their own trauma experience. So in our context, this is the result in terms of the violence. We lost over 3,700 people who died. We had over 50,000 who were injured. And the incidents were largely bombings and shootings, with a significant section of the population being imprisoned as a result of this violence. Tens of thousands of people joined these groups and were armed and engaged in armed violence and combat. And thousands of people were in the security force. So there was lots of different forms of conflict going on. And the legacy of this conflict played out in terms of people's mental health. High rates of post-traumatic stress disorder and complicated grief, high rates of depression. We have very high rates of people with enduring physical pain, and we have high rates of addiction as a means of trying to cope with these traumatic reactions. And of course, over time, we had increased suicide rates, and we have a huge amount of people who are on antidepressants, drugs for their anxiety, and we have high rates of antipsychotic medications as well. And one study looking at the prevalence of PTSD in Northern Ireland found that in comparison to other conflict areas such as the Lebanon, South Africa, and Israel, we had extraordinarily high rates of post-traumatic stress disorder in Northern Ireland. And so, as part of our work over the last 30 years in learning about PTSD and these problems, we have also shared our knowledge with colleagues working after other tragic events. And so our team were involved in training therapists after the 9/11 tragedy in America. And we also provided training to colleagues in Norway after the Anders Breivik killing on the island of Utøya and the other bombing in the city in Norway. So we've had a lot of experience now in trying to distill what we have learned and to share that learning with colleagues elsewhere over the last number of years. And in the more recent experience, which I'll talk about later, we were involved in helping our colleagues in Manchester develop a response to the concert bombing in 2017. And that was, as you referred in the introduction, not just in terms of the therapist's individual response, but in terms of this more strategic level response, which we think is very important in your context at this moment in time, that there has to be a strategic, a high level, a sort of policy developed of how this tragedy is going to be managed in the medium to longer term. And that was part of what we were involved with our colleagues in Manchester in 2017. Now I'm going to talk today a bit about PTSD, which in DSM-5 is described in the following terms. But with ICD-11, we have a slightly different set of criteria. But really the core elements of post-traumatic stress disorder revolve around the first three sets of symptoms, where people are exposed to traumatic situations. They re-experience the trauma in terms of intrusions. They get engaged in persistent avoidance attempts to try to suppress the intrusions. And they have these large sort of changes to their arousal symptoms. So you get lots of hyperarousal, hyperactivity, these very pronounced physiological symptoms that exist as well. And what we want to try to understand, particularly in the aftermath in the immediate aftermath or during conflict and situations that you're going through now is how can we try to predict those who are likely to develop chronic post-traumatic stress disorder? And there is a lot of data on this now. Kessler's studies have found a lifetime prevalence of about 7.8%. They found slightly different rates for female and male after trauma. But we also now have lots of data that tell us that there are different responses after different types of trauma. So we know that trauma that relates to interpersonal violence has got much higher rates of PTSD than trauma that follows from non-interpersonal violence. Rape is still associated with the highest form of rates of PTSD. But war combat is also up there in terms of producing high rates of PTSD. And some groups are at higher risk, so first responders, refugees, higher rates of PTSD, and also soldiers, combatants. You can expect that a proportion of these people who are now defending the country in Ukraine will experience these problems further down the line. We have particularly looked at rates of PTSD after terrorist attacks, and we found that the rates are between 30 and 40%. And interestingly, we find that more traumatic grief reactions, they tend to occur later on and may require more longer term support. We find that there's about 15% who have a delayed onset of PTSD. And the Manchester Concert database is very helpful now in trying to help us map the rate at which PTSD develops after such tragic events. We also, however, know that many people who develop PTSD in the immediate aftermath of a traumatic event will recover naturally. And Rothbaum's work in relation to studies with rape, for example, found that the numbers who presented with these symptoms dropped over 3 months from 94% to 47%. And similarly, Breslow's work showed that the remission rates increased and up to 5 years, 65% had remitted. So this is important to realize that there will be a proportion of people who develop PTSD early on, but many of them will recover themselves without the need for therapeutic help. And this is mapped very nicely on this graph from Kessler studies. And so this is the proportion of people who have PTSD immediately after traumatic events. And this is based on a large number of studies, huge data set here. And this is typically how the population with PTSD recover. So gradually, after 6 months and up to 12 months and 18 months, there is a natural recovery rate. And that's the good news. So about 50% of people will recover. The bad news, however, is that for those who retain PTSD symptoms after about 12 months to 18 months, they are likely to retain their symptoms thereafter. And so a substantial minority of about 30-40% of people will retain PTSD up to 5 years. And this study has been followed up more recently, and this line continues to flatten out up to 10 years afterwards. And I suppose so the secret that we have to try and learn is how do we identify those in this group, the 50 to 60% who will recover, and we leave these people alone, but try to screen and identify this subgroup, this substantial minority who are more vulnerable to retaining PTSD over time. And this really is the group that as therapists, we need to target to provide help and support for. So what I want to touch upon this evening, and really we'll just be able to touch on these subjects because I hope to liaise with your group at a later stage to develop these in more detail. But today we want to look at what are the risk factors of developing PTSD. But given what I just shared with you in that graph, more importantly, what are the risk factors of retaining PTSD over time and of the condition becoming chronic? There are lots of studies. Chris Bruin's meta-analysis help us understand the answers to the first question. So in terms of who are more likely to be vulnerable to developing PTSD, there are lots of variables which his meta-analysis suggests are all relevant. And these are all statistically significant because of the size of this huge analysis set. But essentially in Chris's review, he found there were three categories of risk factors. Factors such as gender and age and race. So pre-trauma factors, they can predict PTSD in some populations, but not in others. Factors such as education, previous trauma, general childhood adversity, they tend to more consistently predict PTSD over a range of populations. And factors such as psychiatric history, childhood abuse and family psychiatric history, they have a more uniform predictive effect across the populations. But the key point is that individually, the effect size of all these risk factors was modest. But factors operating during or after the trauma were actually more relevant than pre-trauma factors. And we need to hold on to that because this is a theme that will run through the next few studies as well. The other meta-analysis that was really useful was produced in 2003 by Ozer and colleagues. And they also did a meta-analysis of predictors. And they found that these were also all statistical factors that were predictive of people developing PTSD. So family history, again, prior trauma were important. Perceived life threat. Dissociation during the trauma had the largest effect size, and other peri-trauma factors such as their emotions at the time and so on, if they perceived their life was in danger. But the focus of this analysis was only on two types of predictors: the characteristics, the personal characteristics of the individual, and the aspects of the traumatic event or its sequelae. And the results of this suggest that the peri-trauma psychological processes, not the prior characteristics, are the strongest predictor of PTSD, a bit similar to some of the findings from Chris Bruin's study. So repeatedly through a whole number of studies, the initial symptoms after the trauma have been shown to be predictive of subsequent PTSD severity. And that's useful, but the meta-analysis by Ozer et al. Looked also at this issue and found that they didn't predict long-term outcome severity when the initial levels were controlled. So what we want to try and understand is, apart from predicting who's more vulnerable to developing PTSD, how can we look at the population who are likely to develop very chronic PTSD from within that group? And there are a number of studies which are useful in this respect. Richard Bryant's work, where he looked at people admitted with traumatic brain injury in Australia. And they found that the key intrusive memories and reactivity, key symptoms that are centrally associated with PTSD, were predictive. And that they were more predictive than other PTSD symptomatology. So symptoms that are, if you like, highly central to the acute symptom network, intrusive trauma memories particularly, are important in understanding who's going to develop chronic PTSD. And other studies built on Richard Bryant's work to see if they could find out a little bit more in this respect. And so they looked at, similar to a Richard Bryant study, these core symptoms, central symptoms to acute stress reactions and PTSD. And they found that these acute symptoms with high strength centrality were the strongest predictors of subsequent PTSD, particularly recurrent and distressing recollections of the trauma. And these were more predictive than other symptoms of PTSD, which are not core central PTSD symptoms. And they found that particularly a sense of foreshortened future and recurrent distressing dreams about the trauma linked many acute symptoms to chronic PTSD. And so this is important because, again, if we think about early interventions, then we want to target these intrusive memories or nightmares and modify these perceptions of a foreshortened future, that these can be particularly helpful in early intervention strategies. So Melanie Klein and colleagues followed up on this in 2007, and they looked at A&E departments, again, where patients had a diagnosis of acute stress disorder at 2 weeks and PTSD at 6 months. And they found that there was the best predictor set was a combination of two variables that were linked to cognitive theory: mental defeat and rumination, and psychological problems prior to the assault. And the combination of these three variables predicted diagnostic status at 6 months in a large proportion of the sample, 88%, and explained almost half the variance in PTSD diagnosis at 6 months compared to 25% explained just by the acute stress disorder diagnosis alone. This is a really important study because it taught us that what we need to look out for in terms of the cognitive variables is if patients present with a high level of mental defeat, if they tend to ruminate a lot about the trauma and its meanings, and if they've had pre-trauma psychological problems, then these are useful also targets for therapy in those early stages and thereafter. Now, Thomas Ehring again and colleagues looked specifically at the cognitive predictors and took this a little bit further. This was published in 2008. And if you think about User's variables, they mainly predicted the onset of symptoms, but they didn't really help us understand, the long-term prediction of chronic PTSD. And this study found that the cognitive variables are highly predictive even at 2 weeks after a traumatic event. And I'll look at that in a little bit more detail in a moment. What's also interesting is that the same predictors are useful when we're working with children and young people. This paper, which I would encourage you also to read, found that when we looked at the cognitive variables, they substantially increased our understanding of the variance in the PTSD rates amongst children and young people at 3 months. And that's a paper I would also commend you to read. Now, I want to move on and just giving you a little flavor of some of those important studies that you can access and read yourselves. We looked at predictors after a number of incidents in Northern Ireland linked to the Northern Ireland conflict. And a number of our key studies followed the Omagh bombing in 1998. This was the single worst incident in the Northern Ireland conflict. A lot of the deaths were children and young people, and a lot of those who were seriously injured were children and young people. And we had a lot of people who were injured with chronic physical injuries. So there was a substantial number of the injured who had enduring chronic pain over many years. This was the scene in Omagh, 1998. This is the car in which the bomb was placed, and there were hundreds of people standing here. And in front of where the camera was, the guy with the camera. Unfortunately, the police moved people to this location where the bomb was because the telephone call from the group planting the bomb indicated that the bomb was at the other end of the town. So people were mistakenly moved exactly to this location. And many of them suffered horrendous injuries. Many people died. Many suffered horrendous burns injuries simply because they were in the wrong place. This is the scene immediately afterwards. This is where the car was. And you can see all the buildings were devastated right around the location. And, this is where all the people, the casualties were, who died and were injured, standing around the scene of the bomb. This is the courthouse at the top of the town where the police were told the bomb was located, and people were moved right to the wrong place. Now, in our studies that followed that awful event, we wanted to learn really a number of things. One, does the degree of exposure lead to an increased risk of PTSD? And are there particular characteristics linked to the individual or the trauma that predict whether people are likely to develop chronic PTSD? And so we conducted 3 studies at that time when, according to Kessler's graph, those who were likely to recover naturally would have done so, and those who were entering the curve in the map where if they had PTSD, they were now likely to retain it over time. So the study took place about a year, just shortly under a year after the explosion. With the children, we collected data in all the schools, and I would encourage you to think about, in the midst of this chaos I know that you're working in now, whether there's any capacity for you also to try and do some research to help us all learn more about how these awful situations impact on populations and how we can help people more with more of an evidence base. So we did a lot of work with the schools and the parents, preparing them for these studies, and we got permission to interview all the kids in the schools. And what we found was with the young people, and there were just under 2,000 children between 8 and 13 in this study who responded. And what we found was that those who weren't there, very low levels of PTSD, depression, and anxiety. If they knew someone who was injured or lost someone, these increased. If they had been there and just left the town, there was also a slight increase. But if they were in town immediately after the bomb or at the time of the bomb, then we had significantly higher rates of PTSD, of depression and anxiety amongst the younger age groups. Now, we asked the same question in relation to the adolescents, but this time we added a lot more questionnaires. And with the adolescent questionnaire, we had a booklet which didn't also just capture their exposure and their responses, but we had questionnaires which looked at their cognitive processing as well. So we were able to look at how they processed the trauma during and afterwards, and what methods they were using to try to adapt to the trauma. And what's interesting in the children's study, this is what we found. We found that gender didn't really matter. When we did our regression analysis and added in, what their peri-trauma experiences were, we found that if the children thought they were going to die at the time, or they saw someone who was seriously injured, these were also significant. But really, when we added in the post-trauma measures, the predictor that really jumped out most of all was if they had a comorbid anxiety disorder. And so amongst the young children, above all these other variables, the one that was the best predictor of whether they were likely to have PTSD was if they were presenting with another form of anxiety. We found amongst the children that about 10% met cases for anxiety, 9% for depression. But as I said, it was mainly the comorbid anxiety disorder which helped us, target those kids or spot those kids who were at higher risk of having chronic PTSD. So the adolescent study, as I mentioned, also was conducted in the schools, and we had a large sample again where we interviewed all the adolescents in the schools and the colleges and asked them about their PTSD symptoms, their general health questionnaires, but this time we included the post-trauma cognitions inventory. The post-trauma cognitions inventory is very useful because it looks at 2 factors really: negative beliefs about yourself or negative beliefs about the world around you in general. We also used a memory questionnaire to try to look at the trauma memories of the young people and particularly how disorganized they were, how the strength of nowness of the memories, and how people responded to those memories, the response to intrusions questionnaire. So this is quite a complex, comprehensive package that we use with the adolescents and also with the adults in our other key study. Again, similar to the children, with the adolescents, the closer you were to the trauma, the more likely you were to develop PTSD and other health problems. Now, this is relevant, I think, to your own population, because I suppose the issue is with your refugee population, how many of them had actual exposure to traumatic events, and how many of them have experienced loss, how many of them have been witnesses at the time of the trauma or afterwards at the scene of the trauma. And this might be useful for your own work. And what we found was, again, a busy slide, sorry about this, but this is really important. With the adolescents, when we looked at their pre-trauma characteristics, all the variables were significant. They are significantly associated with PTSD. When we added in their trauma experience, again, all significantly associated with PTSD. But when we added in the cognitive variables and how the variables linked to the memory and how people were dealing with the trauma memory, then what happened was very interesting. If you look at this top row, we found the pre-trauma variables explain about 19% of the variance in PTSD. That only marginally increased to 22% when we added in their exposure variables. But when we added in the cognitive variables linked to the model, it now jumped to 56%. So it really quite dramatically increased our understanding of the variance in the PTSD scores. And that only increased slightly when we added in post-trauma other variables such as social supports and so on. And at this point, many of these other pre and peri-trauma variables lost their significance in the regression analysis when we added in this other material. So this was very helpful to encourage us to target these variables in our clinic and in our clinical work. So the adolescent study taught us that predictors, exposure alone is not a precise predictor of whether you're going to get PTSD or not. Aspects of the trauma are, particularly if the young person think they're going to die during the trauma, but the key cognitive mechanisms applied thereafter are really crucial, particularly if they develop negative beliefs about themselves, the PTSD, particularly if they ruminate, and particularly if the trauma memory retains a strong sense of nowness as if it's happening over and over again. And this is really important, of course, isn't it? Because we can't do anything about their exposure. We can't do anything about the pre-trauma variables, but as therapists, we can do a lot to help address these cognitive and behavioral strategies that they're using to try to deal with their trauma experience. And so finally, I want to share with you the adult study because the results are quite similar. Again, we had a large sample questionnaires that we distributed in the community to all the households. And people had various experiences. Most of them saw someone close who was injured. Most of them had a direct exposure or indirect exposure. They ran to the hospital afterwards and so on. We used the same measures that we used with the adolescent study. And what we found again was the degree and the type of exposure predicted higher rates of PTSD and general mental ill health. When we looked at the associations with these variables, once again, the pre-trauma variables, they were all significantly associated, but these were quite mild associations. The coefficients got a little bit stronger when we looked at what they were exposed to in the street. But just as within the adolescent study, the strongest associations were with these variables that linked to the cognitive model. If they had negative views about themselves, if they ruminated, if they had strong here and now sense of the memory, and if they tried to suppress their thoughts or the emotion. And when we looked at the cognitive predictors, once again, they were by far, they combined to give us a much a strong understanding of the variance in the PTSD scores compared to these other sets of variables. And this is it just mapped out for you in a pie chart, where they really helped us understand the key predictors that we needed to target with the adult patients who made their way to our clinic as well. Okay, now I want to just do a few more slides about assessment, and then I suggest we break for 5 minutes, about 5 to 6, and then we'll come back to the rest of my presentation at that point, if that's okay. So, how does this all help us in the immediate aftermath of traumatic events? So, for example, with yourselves working in this aftermath of this awful tragedy, well, I think that it helps us to target some of these key cognitive variables to try to predict who's likely to develop chronic PTSD over time. And if we look at rumination, then what we found was that if people ruminate about the trauma and its consequences, then that is a big problem. Now, I understand, and it's difficult when you're working with refugees here, where the future is uncertain, and they're trying to predict how things are going to be. That unpredictability, of course, adds to the problem. But as the conflict settles down, and hopefully that will not be too far away, if people continue to ruminate about what it means, then they're at risk of developing chronic PTSD. And so there are some really good questionnaires you can use to help you sort of make sense of this with your clients and your patients. People often in rumination after trauma ask, why did this happen to me? Was there something I could have done to prevent this? Why did I not see this coming? Was there more I could have done to protect my kids? These sorts of questions are linked to rumination commonly after these sorts of events. And the other big one that jumped out from our studies was mental defeat. And this refers to this process where there's a loss of personal autonomy in the midst of a trauma. Now, once again, in your circumstances, you can see how this could be very relevant, because on the one hand, many people are leaving the country because they've drawn the conclusion that there's little they can do and they want to keep their families safe. But if people ruminate about that and then start to think that there was more they could have and should have done, they can lead to this sense of mental defeat, a sense of helplessness and hopelessness that has been found to be very predictive of chronic PTSD. And it's common amongst survivors of assault and torture victims particularly, but it's also something to watch out for amongst your populations. And the other big one that jumped out for us was this sense of nowness of the trauma memory. So many people in that first graph I showed you, many of those people who will recover will have intrusions in the immediate aftermath. For 3 months, up to 6 months even after a trauma, they will experience intrusions. But the key factor is how strong those intrusions are, how much they retain a sense of nowness, how as if the trauma is vividly happening over and over again. And this perceived nowness of the trauma memory is a very important predictor. So when I remember the assault, it's like it's happening again over and over. The strength of those feelings and beliefs is very important to help you predict people who are more vulnerable. Now, people often ask about dissociation. Is this not an important predictor? And I think that our work would say yes, but I think that it's in and of itself not a key separate predictor, because it's usually linked to severe symptoms of re-experiencing and hyperarousal and avoidance. It may not be a unique independent predictor as was previously suggested. It may simply be a reflection of severe PTSD. And what's really important is that people are given an understanding, that your clients, an understanding of what dissociation means. Because in our experience, it's the person's belief about dissociation that's often the problem. If they think it's something strange and weird, and an indication that they're losing their mind, then we have to try and help them understand that really dissociation is simply a symptom of severe PTSD. It's a way of the mind trying to avoid thinking about it and not being overcome by the trauma memory. And we find that commonly when people are giving a good explanation, the dissociation itself loses its threatening power. Now, so what should we be doing about all this in the early phase, in the immediate aftermath? Well, there are lots of studies about psychological first aid and what to do and what not to do. I think the World Health Organization's guidance here is useful. And I think you've had a couple of talks on this, so I won't go into too much detail. But it is really important working with vulnerable populations that the following variables are put in place. There has to be a sense of safety, a sense of self-efficacy and community efficacy is important. And I think that's a big issue for yourselves at the moment. How do you retain a sense of community efficacy when your community is being traumatized? In the Ukraine and in Poland, when your community is being probably destabilized by the threat that's not too far away from you, but also trying to mobilize to help all these people who need help, who are coming from the Ukrainian, the tragedy that's unfolding in Ukraine. So it's about trying to ensure that people retain the self-efficacy, and it's not easy to do in these difficult circumstances. But also it's important that people stay connected. And with mobile phone networks these days and so on, these things are a little bit easier. It's also important that people experience a sense of calmness and retain a sense of hope. And these are important factors that have to be built into psychological responses to refugees and other vulnerable populations. And if you bear in mind that we want to try to prevent people who develop acute stress reactions from developing chronic enduring PTSD, then all of these factors are likely to help in this immediate aftermath. There's also the TENS guidelines for psychosocial care following disaster, and you can download these from the site. And this is really based on expert witnesses' advice. So there are a consensus report, and they outline, the evidence for health and social care that should be provided after disasters. Once again, the provision of general support, good social support, physical support, and psychological support, they're outlined in more detail in these documents. But I have to say that, a lot of these reports are based on expert guidelines because, of course, usually after large-scale tragedies like this, there's not a great emphasis placed on research because, understandably, the emphasis is on helping people and trying to provide a response. And so we get into activist mode, we get into doing mode, we get into wanting to help mode, which is understandable. But I think it's also important that, we have to, in addition to providing those supports and help, if it's possible, we need to have the capacity to try and learn from these awful tragedies. If we can undertake research, that's ethically defined and clearly ethically approved, then it would be really, really useful so that we can develop more of an evidence base about how we help people in these awful tragedies. Because unfortunately, with the world we live in, it's inevitable that there will be tragedies, in the years ahead, I believe. So we need to try and learn, but we also need to try and plan ahead. In addition to being active and engaged in providing help at the moment, we need to think about the more longer term. We need to plan for the medium to longer term, and we need to take time out to do that. And I'll talk a little bit more about this after the break. There's also the Interagency Standing Committee's report, and they talk about providing a very basic psychological first aid for people in the acute aftermath of such tragic events. And the Isaac report makes it clear that a lot of these supports don't have to be provided by professionals or mental health professionals, but they can be provided with volunteers and other people who can be trained up quickly in the principles of psychological first aid. And that's important in terms of drawing in as much resources as we can to try and provide these support in the early aftermath of trauma. John Bisson and his colleagues have done a really good systematic review, and that's which you will find in the World Health Organization's reports. And they also reinforce some of these points that interventions should be provided. Individuals should understand what's being offered, and that we have to take into consideration the context in which we're making help available. They make the point about how we offer help being done in an empathic manner for vulnerable populations is really important. And they, although there's not a lot of empirical data, they say that there's considerable evidence, anecdotal evidence, that individuals don't do so well if they feel that they're not being supported or they're not being validated. They're not being their loss and their experience is not being adequately acknowledged, particularly amongst refugees if they go into another country and so on. And of course, that is certainly not how I see things in Poland at the moment, where there seems to be some wonderful work being done there. But it's important that these guidelines, of course, are shared with your colleagues and others, such as employers and people in authority, that they're aware that these principles are really, really important. So whilst we don't have this strong evidence base and we can't make a strong evidence-based recommendations, we have these guidelines at the moment are really as good as it gets. They're what we have. But of course, we should make sure we don't do things that are unhelpful. And I'll just finish with this slide, and then we'll take a short break, as an example of why it's important where we do have empirical evidence that we learn from it. And so, for example, in our guidelines in the UK, in the NICE guidelines, they make it clear that we should not offer critical incident stress debriefing, or CISD, after traumatic events. And that's because there's been a number of randomized controlled trials that have found this has not been helpful. And I'll just show you one of the studies that Richard Mayhew and his colleagues conducted where they looked at people who developed PTSD after road traffic accidents. And when they looked at the group who got debriefing, and they compared it to the control group who got nothing at all. And when they looked at the group, they didn't really focus too much on those who had mild symptoms because there was no real difference between the two groups. But when they looked at the group who provided with the more severe PTSD symptoms, this was the group who got debriefing. So at baseline, this was their score, the mean score. At 4 months after debriefing, this was their mean score. And 3 years later, this was their mean score. Now, on face value, it looks like the debriefing may have helped them because the mean score seems to have dropped. But they're still in the moderate to severe category of PTSD. Let's look at the group, the control group, who got no intervention at all. And this is where the study threw up lots for us to be concerned about. Because the control group did much better without any intervention and remained much better 3 years later. So something about the intervention was getting in the way of people's recovery process. And this was a lesson to us all, that in this immediate aftermath after trauma, when we all feel compelled to help, we all feel compelled to do something. We have a humanitarian urge to want to do something to help people. But it's a reminder to us that whatever we're going to offer, it should not be something that actually harms people's recovery. And this study was a powerful reminder to us that what we have to do, really, it should be as much as possible based on the evidence that we have available at the time. Okay, so I think we'll take a break here now for 5 minutes for comfort break, and then we'll come back again and I'll finish the presentation, if that's okay with you, Aisha.
Absolutely perfect. Thank you so much.
Okay.
So see you in 5 minutes.
See you then.
Thank you.
Bye.
So Michael, are you surviving? I hope so. Good for you. That was just enough time to go and get it. Yes, life-saving, life-saving.
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely. Is this going okay?
Yes, absolutely. Wonderful, wonderful. And thank you for this break, because as we were talking, we try to emphasize that really giving yourself a time and chance to rest and sort of time out, it's very important in this part of.
Yeah, I'm going to talk about that at the end of the talk. You know, I'm just going to specifically deal with that, about pacing yourselves and, you know, looking after yourselves and so on.
Okay, so I think we can continue. So if this is okay, just go ahead.
Okay. Can you just give me the nod if you can see things again? Can you see my slides?
Yes.
Okay.
Brilliant.
So, what should we do in the immediate aftermath? Well, you know, in that initial phase, which you've come through, psychological first aid and all the support measures that you're putting in place are really the things to do. But when you move into beyond the first few weeks, people start presenting with symptoms of PTSD. Then this early intervention study shows that, you know, using trauma-focused CBT can help people with that early phase post-traumatic stress disorder, stop them developing very chronic PTSD. And so it's really the study compared a wait list and self-help material to CBT, and you can see that it was really effective at that stage. So we use a shorter protocol of trauma-focused CBT, targeting those key elements that I've mentioned to you in my earlier slides. Now, in Northern Ireland, we've a number of clinical studies. I'm going to present from two. One is the study that we did after the Oma bomb. So this would have been with people who would have been exposed to a single trauma, and it would have been, you know, in that early stage. And the second study I'll present is with a very chronic population from across Northern Ireland. In some cases, people who had PTSD for 30 years and managed on medications. And just to show you the effects in terms of how trauma-focused CBT can be helpful. And so when we look at the model that has, if you like, the strongest base now across the UK and I think in Europe, the Ehlers-Clark model, the key elements of this model suggest that PTSD is really maintained because it's people perceive it as there's a current serious threat still around after the trauma. And that current sense of threat really is due to some issues in relation to trauma memory, but also that there are these negative appraisals or added meanings about the trauma or the aftermath that have been developed. And then people engage in a whole range of strategies to try to control the threat, but they're counterproductive. And this is how it's represented diagrammatically. I will not go into it in great detail, just to give you a flavor of the model that we will talk about, I think, at a future stage. But really what we want to do is elaborate the memory, modify the appraisals, deal with the triggers that are inducing the intrusions, and drop these unhelpful strategies. So just briefly to run through these, the problem with the trauma memory is that, first of all, there are real problems trying to intentionally recall the trauma. Our patients report an absence of details that they can't remember. The order of what happened is out of sync. Often they get it mixed up, and often there are gaps in the trauma memory. But when they have these intrusive memories, they're very rich sensory fragments. They can smell the smells during the trauma. They can hear the sounds of the screaming during the trauma. They can see the awful images that they saw during the trauma and so on. They re-experience the same powerful negative emotions, and there is no time perspective. So each time they have the intrusion, it seems as if the trauma is happening over again. These intrusions can be induced by a wide range of triggers. And this is because the trauma memory is not fully integrated with the rest of the memories, the rest of the autobiographical memories, and therefore it's hard to intentionally recall it, and it's easily re-experienced by triggers because of this lack of elaboration as well. Now, we've realized working in a conflict zone that these triggers are really important. Many of our patients come to the clinic thinking that these intrusions just come out of the blue. And so they have a negative belief very commonly that there's no control over these intrusions. There's nothing they can do to stop them. And that's frightening. But when they learn that these intrusions are triggered by something that resembles their trauma experience, it begins to generate a degree of controllability. And so we have to try and spot what these triggers are. They're often very low level sensory cues, and they're similar to what they experienced during the trauma, but they're unnoticed often. And that's what's often very scary and frightening for our patients. This is one of my patients, Desi, and he experienced intrusions triggered by the following cues. If he saw anything that was covered with black plastic, he had an intrusion. If he heard the sound of running water, he had a flashback. If he smelled something that was like a rubber, he would have a flashback. And these intrusions really highly distressed him until we spotted the triggers early on in therapy. We realized that he was in charge of putting dead bodies in body bags after an explosion. And the black plastic was similar to the color and the type of material in the body bag. And so it was a trigger. We learned that when he was lifting bodies, he was walking through a burst pipe in the street. And so the sound of the running water was a trigger. And we also learned that when he was carrying people into the helicopter to go to hospital, he was in the tight space surrounded by police and soldiers who were wearing body armor, and he felt terrified in that moment in time. And so anything that similarly smelled like that body armor was a trigger. So we were able to spot the triggers, and it was so important for Desi that he could recognize that there was a trigger for each of them. So, of course, as part of CBT, we have to relive the trauma. And again, I'm not going into that in detail this evening, but just to say that there are two ways of doing this. With people who have been exposed to the trauma directly, reliving works really well, because we also access the emotion, imaginal reliving, going into the trauma in the safety of the clinic. We access important missing details. And we find that with reliving, it doesn't just intellectually process the trauma, but it emotionally processes the trauma as well. There's a felt change in the meaning. Now, narrative work's very important also, particularly if the person has been exposed to multiple traumas or a trauma that's lasted over a long period of time. And so it helps to begin to write it out. And we find that this is a very useful device, and it also works well in traumatic grief. Now, the purpose of all these techniques of reliving or narrative work, of course, is that we want to try and update the trauma memory. And what we do is we want to flush out these negative beliefs that keep the PTSD alive. These appraisals, maybe that the outcome was better than expected. So we can find that out when we go into the trauma narrative. It may be we get contradictory information. There was nothing more I could have done to prevent it happening. It may be that the person realized the perception at the time wasn't true, so that the bomb was really just a hoax bomb, for example. And when we go back into these the trauma narrative, it is really important to flush out these meanings, because we need to install these actual new meanings in the trauma memory to challenge the meanings that are just causing the patient to be distressed. And so we flush out the negative appraisals. We also produce an updated version of the narrative. We will add in what we now know, the new information, and produce an updated version of the written narrative with all these new meanings installed. So I now know that my son didn't die, for example. I now know that there was nothing I could have done to prevent that child dying. I now know that there was nothing I could have done to try and prevent this happening. And we insert these new meanings during short, targeted reliving sessions thereafter. And this is just an example of a young patient of mine. What she believed during the trauma was that these gunmen came to her door, came to her home. She was standing in the street outside with her friends. The gunmen left a device in the window of their house. She froze. She wanted to do something, but she was paralyzed on the spot. She couldn't move. And the gunman, as he walked out, pointed the gun at her and said to her something like, if you move, you'll never take another step. So this young teenager was transfixed on the spot. And what she believed then was all of the following things. Now, first of all, her mother ran out and grabbed the device. And her mother threw the device over the hedge. And she looked at this at the time. Mum picks it up. It's a bomb. She will be killed. What we learned from the reliving and from the discussion afterwards was that it wasn't an actual bomb. It was a hoax bomb, and Mum doesn't get killed. She sees the bomb in the windowsill. Why is it our windowsill? We are all going to die. And these beliefs, these appraisals, go through her mind each time she has an intrusion. What we now know, and through therapy we elicit in the start, it's not a bomb. It was left in our windowsill by mistake. We will all survive this, is the key new meaning. And we go through each of these beliefs that she has during the trauma. An important one was, I should do something instead of stupidly saying, that's my house. I feel stupid. We now know, as we evaluated this behavior, that if she had tried to intervene, the gunman may have actually shot her. Worse still, her parents may have ran out of the house and they might have actually been killed. So standing still probably saved me and my family. And this is a powerful, much more helpful set of beliefs compared to these beliefs that she had during the trauma. And when we construct these new meanings, we go through the trauma again, relive it, and at each of these points, I ask her, what do we now know? And she inserts this new information and updates the trauma memory. And this is very powerful. And if we can do this at an early stage with all these young people who may be traumatized and who may have doubts about what they should and they shouldn't have done in Ukraine, who may have all these doubts about why they left and so on, and then it can perhaps be extremely helpful in preventing them developing chronic PTSD reactions. And this is another example of a lady of mine who was walking along the road with her kids and the car collided into them. And she had the belief at the time that her baby was dead. and we insert all the new meanings that we do, in therapy. He isn't dead now. I know he's unconscious. He'll be okay. Yet each time this lady had a flashback, this belief that my baby is dead was as strong as it was during the actual event. And so we get all this new data. I shouldn't have brought the children on the road. I'm an awful mother. What was her belief in the days after the trauma? We flush out the reasons that she actually brings her kids out. And of course, it's because she's a good mother. She takes them out for walks. And we get all these new information early in therapy. And we do the same as with the young patient in the last slide. We insert these in the trauma memory, update the trauma memory, and her intrusions dramatically lose their power. Now, another part of what we do is site visits, where we will bring our patients back to the site of the trauma. And this assists us with getting data collection, discovering new things that we can update the trauma memory with. It also discourages avoidance of particular trauma sites. But this may not always be possible. And I'm thinking again of your own circumstances now. It might not be possible with some refugees to bring them back to the site of the trauma, but it might be in the near future. And you have to weigh this up in your own clinics. This is a young patient of mine whose friend died in her arms at this site, and she blamed herself for the death. She blamed herself for causing the bus to crash at that spot. We go back to the scene of the trauma, and we discover that there were all sorts of other factors there which may have caused the bus to crash. The fact that there was a road works going on, that it was a busy junction, and none of this she had remembered during her trauma work in the early stages. In the reliving, we didn't even access some of this information. But when we went back to the site of the trauma, we discovered all this very important new information, which helped challenge this powerful negative belief that the bus crashed because she was messing about with her friend at the back of the bus and distracted the driver. And she believed 100% that she was the cause of the accident. And so the site visit was powerful in gathering all this data to help us undermine that belief. Now, the other key thing that we do is that we try to identify what the most powerful beliefs are for that individual, these key negative appraisals. And we do that during the reliving by following the hotspots. So if you get your clients to write out the narrative of the trauma, there will be a lot of it that will be, really upsetting information, but it might not all be distressing information. And so what we have to do is follow the hotspots where the affect gets really, really high. Sometimes it's just quiet spots. Sometimes it's where they skip over pieces. And we want to try and probe what's going on behind these hotspots. We probe for the meanings behind them. And these usually are the key appraisals that we need to discover, we need to modify, we need to change. And I just want to caution you that even though you may be dealing with thousands of people who have had similar experiences, they're all refugees from the same conflict, don't assume that their individual appraisals will be the same. We have treated, thousands of people affected by the conflict in Northern Ireland. We have treated hundreds of people caught up in the same event. And we have always been surprised how different their individual appraisals are, even relating to the same event. So be aware of therapists' assumptions, and remember that you need to probe with the hotspot to flush out the individual meanings for that individual. Be sensitive if the key emotion is shame or guilt, because often they don't hand up those beliefs or those appraisals easily. You have to probe a wee bit more carefully to try and unearth those appraisals. I think you may find that there may be lots of key emotions amongst the population. Fear is not the only emotion that occurs with PTSD. There may well be intense fear, terror in the population after this invasion of Ukraine. Over time, that can change, and the emotion can become guilt or anger. And what we typically find that where there's a lot of guilt, that the appraisals are about an exaggerated sense of responsibility. So the mother taking her children away from the village or the town, who now feels guilty that she's removed them from their own culture, their own environment, and that she's disrupted their lives. And her appraisals maybe are about this extreme sense of responsibility and not making allowances for the fact that this was the step that she needed to take to protect her kids' lives. So probe underneath the emotion for appraisals, usually around the person's belief about their actions or their failures to act during the event. And using pie charts is really useful here. So with my lady who believed she was responsible for the road traffic accident that led to her children being crushed by the car, early in therapy, she believed that we managed to reduce the belief to the fact that the guy driving the car was 50% responsible, but she was still 50% responsible. But as we worked on that in therapy and we got a list of all from her reliving session, we got all sorts of new information. We found that the road was narrow. She remembered that it had been raining before the crash. And she remembered that the young fellow driving the car had been driving chaotically. All of this she only got from the reliving. And when we put this additional information down and allocated percentages against it, when we inputted these to the pie chart, there was only a tiny little piece left for her being responsible compared to this, where she was 50% responsible. So pie charts, very useful working with responsibility beliefs. You may get a lot of appraisals driving anger as well. If this lasts over time, the anger can become a problem. There, I think, is an important distinction between justifiable anger, or one of my patients called it, she said, this is righteous anger that I feel for the people who killed my son. So I think it's important to differentiate between that sort of anger, legitimate, righteous anger that people have when their country has been invaded, with prolonged, enduring anger that can turn into hatred over time. And that hatred can become pathological. And the only person really who suffers from it is the individual and the family, maybe that they're caring for. And so often we will ask the question with our patients about who's going to win if you hold on to this anger and who's going to lose. Will it affect Mr. Putin if you're sitting in your house in the Ukraine feeling angry for the next year? Will it impact negatively on the people who've invaded your country, or will it impact on you and your family? And so we do this, who wins with anger, and it has a good effect. What's to be gained from holding on to anger? How would you like to look back 10 years from now is a good one as well. If you retain this angry state, how does it affect your relationship with your kids? 10 years from now, 5 years from now, how would you want your kids to remember you? The mother who was always angry? Or would you like to look back from now and say, my mum was very angry at the start with what happened to our country, but she managed to let go of that anger and we were able to retain a good, warm relationship as a result of that. So timeline, retrospective approach to anger works really well. This is one of my patients who was a member of the army locally, and he had severe PTSD, and he had been a bomb had been put into the car, and his girlfriend was very badly injured, in that explosion. Shortly after, she broke up the relationship. And he had all sorts of negative appraisals about his role. He got out to redirect traffic away from the bomb, but he retrospectively reappraised that as, I abandoned my girlfriend. There was an old couple who drove over part of the bomb because he was trying to redirect traffic. They come up on the side from him. He blamed himself for their behavior. And all sorts of negative appraisals. And he developed severe PTSD. He also had repeated life threats for a number of years afterwards. He had an overgeneralized sense of fear. And this is something to watch out for, I think, when the refugees perhaps return to the Ukraine, or even some of the soldiers who return from frontline duty, that they can retain this exaggerated sense of threat. And this was common in our society, that even though there was a ceasefire and the war ended here in 1998, for many, many years, a lot of these soldiers and police officers remained hyper vigilant because their appraisals about the level of threat were never modified and updated. The trauma memory was never modified and updated. And so they remained on red alert, on the lookout for danger. But of course, that fundamentally shattered their ability to re-engage with society, and often it damaged their relationships with their partners and so on. 80, the man I've just referred to, was scared everywhere. He refused to walk into town during the daytime. He refused to walk into Catholic shops because he perceived all Catholics as members of the terror groups that planted the bomb and so on. But he did well after therapy, and in a wonderful behavior experiment where we brought him into a shop that was attended mainly by members just of the other population, and it worked really well as part of therapy when the people in the shop smiled at him and were courteous to him, and none of them offered him any threatening glances or threatened him in any way. So behavior experiments work really well with 80. So what's really important in this early phase, in the aftermath of trauma, is trying to explain to your clients the importance of not becoming withdrawn from activities in their lives that they normally would engage with. Now, again, I understand that that's difficult during the conflict at the moment, but hopefully when there is some sort of ceasefire and peace concluded, and people start to return to their communities, it is really important that they try to re-engage with former activities as soon as they can. The danger is if they avoid activities, they ruminate, they get locked into these negative thinking patterns. They may use alcohol to suppress their symptoms, and the PTSD becomes chronic over time. Now, I just share with you some of the things that we find when we were treating people with PTSD. And then I want to then talk a little bit about our work with helping advise colleagues after the Manchester bombing in trying to set up systems that might be useful based on our experience. So this is the first study we did after the Omagh bombing. And we took the first 91 patients and randomized into the centre and allocated them to trauma-focused CBT. The therapists were NHS staff with heavy caseloads. They had a modest training in CBT. So these were not specialists in PTSD. We had a brief training program in how to use trauma-focused CBT, and they attended the clinic. Now, the good news is that everybody in the trial improved. Some improved a lot more than others. The average recovery was about 70%. And the good news is this happened in a mean number of 8 sessions. Some people did really well after 2 sessions. Early intervention, targeting rumination, mental defeat, simple behavior experiments. 2 sessions was enough to prevent the person developing chronic PTSD. The good news also was that comorbidity didn't predict poor outcome. The effect sizes were impressive. And also, lack of social support didn't affect outcome. And whether or not they were a civilian or a member of the armed or the emergency personnel didn't predict poor outcome either. What was relevant, though, in this first trial was if they had enduring physical health problems, they didn't do as well. They did okay, but not as well as the rest of the sample. So that's an important issue, because you're going to have to weigh this one up if you're working with people who have both psychological and physical injuries. Now, the second study was a randomized controlled trial. And this was with a very chronic group from across the region. They had a huge number of traumatic events in some cases, and about 20% were physically injured. Most of them had multiple traumas, and the duration of the episode of PTSD was about 8.9 years on average, but some of these people had PTSD for 30 odd years. And there was a high rate of comorbidity. And also, importantly, many of them had had previous psychological help, but it hadn't really worked for them. And so for that half the sample, there was a substantial degree of skepticism whether or not this treatment would be any different and would be able to help them. Now, most of these patients had experienced bombings and shootings. Some had been taken hostage or had been assaulted by paramilitary groups. Some had been in road traffic accidents trying to escape a bomb or shooting. Some had been attacked during riots. We used PTSD measure and other measures, including the social functioning scale, and we randomized the group to either a waiting list or trauma-focused CBT immediately, and then the waitlist group got trauma-focused CBT at the 12 weeks later. We followed them all up 3, 6, and 12 months post-treatment. So this is your waitlist group, and as you can see, there was no change in their PTSD scores during the 12 weeks in the waitlist, but the treatment group did really well and maintained that follow-up a year later. And when the waitlist group went into treatment at this stage, they also progressed along the same line. So we're really encouraged by this because it was a very chronic group, as I've already explained. Okay, so I've already explained the results. What was fascinating about this was that it actually had a mean number of sessions less than the previous trial. And the reason we think for this was that our therapists had become more experienced. The first trial was done a number of years earlier, and we had now really skilled up the therapists how to treat PTSD. And so they were a lot more sophisticated than they were during the first trial. Now, interestingly, the factors that were associated with less improvement are important here. If they had a really high level of depression, as well as PTSD, they didn't do as well. And this, we're talking about a score of greater than 40 in the depression inventory, which means severe PTSD. And there's a learning point for us there. I think that if someone is severely depressed and has PTSD, you really need to treat the depression first. Offer some behavioral activation to get the mood up a little bit in order that they can engage in therapy better. The second factor was if the longer time since trauma to treatment. And this is really important and relates to our discussion this evening. Because if we can access clients at an earlier stage, they will have a higher rate of recovery. The longer it is until we access people with PTSD, then the recovery rates drop over time. Now, what's interesting, however, in this study was this time we found there were factors that were not associated with recovery. So just having a comorbid disorder by itself didn't predict poor outcome. It was only if they had severe levels of depression. Where they had comorbidity, they needed a few more sessions, but they did just as well in general terms. Interestingly, this time, if they had an enduring physical health problem, it didn't predict poor outcomes. Why is that to be the case? Well, I think for two reasons. I think, first of all, probably some of those patients, when we looked at their notes, had learned how to adapt to their physical injury. But also our therapists became more skilled about how to deal with the problem and how to break the link between the physical injury acting as a trigger to induce their intrusions linked to their PTSD and other techniques that we learn. If the traumatic event was directly experienced or witnessed, didn't matter. So if the person was attacked directly or witnessed someone being attacked, it didn't lead to any, different outcomes. And interestingly, whether they had a single or multiple traumas didn't impact on their outcomes either. That's really encouraging, given the fact that many people you may see, particularly the soldiers coming back from the front line, may be exposed to multiple traumas. So we did a lot of dissemination with our work. Some of it was we trained the therapists after 9/11 in how to treat PTSD, for example. But we also trained the team who were working with the Norwegian victims of this tragic event in the Utøya Island and the bombing near Oslo, and they were particularly concerned about complex grief. So I want to talk a little bit about complex grief. There are a number of studies now that are very helpful flowing from that work in Norway. One of the studies that looked at bereaved parents particularly, and they found some interesting findings. First of all, that they found that there was a difference between parents in terms of the recovery to the traumatic experiences. They found that overall there was a slight reduction in both PTSD and complicated grief from 18 to 40 months after these attacks. But mothers showed a slower recovery than fathers. And 6 out of 10 parents were still struggling with intense grief at 40 months after this tragic event as well. The majority, in fact, still scored above the cutoff points for PTSD and complicated grief. And over half the parents reported they were either partly or totally still out of work at 40 months. So not just suffering psychologically, but in terms of their ability to function, they were still suffering with their social and occupational functioning as well. And again, mothers experienced the greatest loss of function at 40 months compared to fathers. Fathers had the greatest difficulty in social reconnection, but in terms of work, it was the mothers who experienced higher levels of disability. So we've studied complex grief, and Jennifer Wilde and I have published this paper, which you can read. We're just publishing an updated paper in the June edition of this journal, coming out in a few weeks' time, with just some more advice for clinicians. And I'll run through this quite quickly, but essentially, we built our work in complicated grief, traumatic grief, around our work with PTSD. So essentially, there are problems with the memory. And in the case of traumatic grief, what you find is that the death has not been linked to other memories involving the deceased. So trying to accept that the loss is permanent can be a problem for people with traumatic grief. It leads to a sense that the deceased isn't permanent and that the person is still present and is still in need of attention or still suffering after the trauma. And we have to try and find a way of updating the memory. It is easier if people have some belief in a form of afterlife so that we can help move on the image of the deceased person to this afterlife. But it's not necessary. We can still use techniques to help the bereaved person accept that the loss is permanent and the person is no longer able to play a part in their lives. The problem with triggers, of course, unlike PTSD, is that in traumatic grief, triggers are everywhere. They're all the objects in the family home, all sorts of activities that they do or did with the deceased and so on. So we have to try and find a way of managing these triggers slightly differently. When it comes to the beliefs or the typical appraisals, they tend to be in these categories, often about the individual who's bereaved. The person with traumatic grief commonly believes that I have now changed as a person since the loss. I can never be the same again. I am no longer the person I was. So these very powerful negative beliefs about the self are common. Typically, they have beliefs about the person and how they died. A belief that they suffered at the last minute. Perhaps they suffered for a long time and no one was there to help them. And a preoccupation with the unfairness of not just the death, but the lost opportunities that the person has missed out on are very common. And the third set of appraisals that are common are about other people's so inability to understand, a perception that other people don't understand, or that other people's behavior is often misinterpreted as an indication that they no longer care. And so we have to flush these out in order to help them re-engage with other people and continually to stay socially connected. And finally, in terms of the key strategies or behaviors that are used to deal with complicated and traumatic grief, these are the common ones. They tend to ruminate, again, just like PTSD. And then when they ruminate, it feeds into this powerful yearning and missing the person who's deceased, and the need to urge to care for or nurture them becomes so profound with these rumination phases. They avoid any reminders of the loss, or anything that reminds them that the loss is permanent is avoided. And at the same time, they get engaged in these time-consuming rituals, such as maintaining websites, attending to the grave, but in an obsessional fashion, or retaining the bedroom of the child who died as if they were still here and needed to be cared for and nurtured. And so we use the PTSD model just to conceptualize traumatic grief, but with some differences, of course. The triggers are more widely present. The appraisals are usually slightly in different areas. And there's this slightly different presentation of complicated grief compared to PTSD, where the intrusions are usually around this, how the person died, but also related to the acute need to nurture the deceased or be nurtured if it's the case of a child who's lost a parent. So I haven't time to go into this in more detail, but just to say to you that if you're working with people who are traumatically bereaved, your assessment really needs to try again, just like with PTSD, to differentiate between people who are grieving and those who are suffering from this more pathological form of grief. That's really important. Most people who are suffering from grief will suffer from intense emotion, but they don't need professional help. In fact, a lot of the trials that have looked at bereavement interventions have proven that they've been no better compared to the waitlist conditions, the people who didn't receive anything at all. And some of the meta-analysis of bereavement work have found that the effect sizes are really small. So we have to differentiate between people who present with these more symptoms of prolonged traumatic grief, and those are the group that we should target for therapy. And people who are suffering from grief reactions, but they're in the normative range of grief reactions, we should really allow those people to adapt naturally. And we can use these questionnaires to differentiate between the two groups. And of course, we should consider cultural and societal norms when we're trying to make these assessments as well. I want to just briefly deal with these big maintenance strategies that run across PTSD and traumatic grief, because they're important to target early on as well. So for example, rumination. We should really try and explain to our people and use an explanation in their own language. This circular thinking, for example. What if? Why did this happen to our family? What have I done? What should I have done to stop this happening? And we need to give a lot of explanation about these unhelpful cycles. They're often connected to appraisals about responsibility or unfairness or humiliation. So we need to find out what these appraisals are. And even though these cycles might start, unintentionally, they do become almost automatic sort of thinking styles. We have to explain, however, the person has the capacity to disengage from them. And so we help them to identify and label the process and raise their awareness of it so they can nip it in the bud at an earlier stage. Use their own label. Don't call it rumination. One of my patients says, it's my roundabout thinking. I get stuck in the roundabout. Use that phrase. Watch out for rumination in session and use it as an opportunity to educate, to raise awareness about it, and never collude with rumination in session. In fact, if necessary, interrupt it to try and help your patient recognize that they have the capacity to break the cycle themselves out of the session. And so we use all sorts of techniques to do this. We reduce the settings where they're more likely to ruminate. Sitting on my own for a long time. How can we stop that? We decide what can be changed, what can't, and focus on what can be done in the present to make changes. Don't ruminate about what you can't change. We transform why thinking into how thinking, and use the way we would do in general anxiety, use postponement of rumination the way we'd use postponement using a worry chair. That will be your rumination chair, and so on. So these techniques, very effective for rumination. Now, I want to just talk also about, in addition to therapy, what people might need outside therapy. And you may have to work with families, particularly if you're working with a lot of kids who are affected by trauma. Then you'll need to involve the parents. But that doesn't mean that you abandon the individual work. Family work can help, but it's not a substitute for working with the individual needs of the child. The second thing I'd like to flag up to you is, I call it, beware of group sparing gifts. We had a lot of examples in Northern Ireland of these groups arriving to provide help. And you have to be careful, because we found some of those groups did more harm than good. They encouraged people to sit around and ruminate, for example, in a very unhelpful way. We also found that there were groups that were there to try and help victims become involved in justice campaigns against the injustice of what happened. And the problem with some of those groups was that they do tend to perpetuate a lot of anger. And so when we were trying to work with our individual patients to get beyond the anger, to allow them to feel a bit more at ease with themselves and their families, these groups would regenerate that anger when they would go to the meetings. So you have to work out what's to be gained from involvement in these campaigns. And perhaps people may need to disengage for a little while until they feel a bit more stronger, emotionally intact, until they've dealt with their PTSD and traumatic grief. Then they can re-engage in campaigns, but in a more contained and controlled manner. So my final couple of slides are really to look at how we've tried to help other communities that have been traumatized. And the Manchester bomb was a good example of this. So we talked with the health trusts in Manchester. There were several trusts involved after that awful tragic event. And they organized a conference over a few days. And there were different audiences. So we addressed different audiences. So the first audience was mainly staff providing psychological care. That would have CBT therapists, psychologists, and others. And that involved covering some of the material we talked about this evening. How to deal with early interventions. How do you look out for predictors of chronic PTSD and differentiate between the groups, and what to look for when you're working with groups. We talked about potential pitfalls and so on. We had a session specifically looking at the needs of children, and we looked at trauma-focused treatments for children and adolescents. We looked at particular evidence-based approaches then for chronic PTSD. And importantly, we looked at the self-care of staff involved in that event. And I really want to flag this up to yourselves as one of my final comments this evening. This is not a tragedy that's going to end, even if there is a ceasefire in a few weeks' time. Unfortunately, the psychological fallout of this will last for a long time ahead. And so you as therapists and professionals and others involved in trying to help the victims of this awful tragedy have to recognize that you need to plan for the long haul. So pacing is important here to protect the staff who are providing the interventions at this stage in order that they continue to provide care and support for people affected by this tragedy in the longer term as well. And in Northern Ireland, we had unfortunate examples where some of our staff burnt out after these large-scale tragedies because they threw themselves in far too deeply. They were activists providing care, support, and therapy. But they did that at the expense of their own health. And so we need to ensure that you guys look after yourselves and that the systems are in place to look after you, and that you have good supervisors, good managerial support to make sure that somebody's caring for the carers and all this, looking after the therapists. The second thing we did with the Manchester grouping was we had a second separate session more for strategic managers, systems managers, service leads, and so on. And that was about planning ahead. That was about preparing beyond the initial aftermath of the tragedy, making sure the systems were in place to access and allow people who were affected to access help, having a joined up response, all the agencies talking to each other, the schools, the mental health teams, the social services teams, all linking up and talking to each other and making sure that people who needed help were able to access it easily without red tape, bureaucracy, and systems getting in the way. And what we find is that after these events, these standard referral pathways are ineffective. We need to recognize that these are extraordinary circumstances, and we need to build in extraordinary measures to respond to the needs of the populations. We need to have good outreach and screening mechanisms in place. After the 9/11 tragedy in New York, for example, what the research found was that the people who sought help were mainly only those who had already been in existing mental health services. We found after the London bombings in 7/7 that third-party referrals from GPs and police and others was largely ineffective. The best way of people accessing help is to have open self-access to referrals. So we have to facilitate people themselves self-referring into the systems that are providing the therapy. We also found that telephone contact can be really helpful. And we found this after the London 7/7 bombings, that people sought help, and the telephone contact they found very useful. And as a result of COVID-19, of course, the pandemic, we have found that we can deliver really effective therapies using online methods. We've got to be innovative in having all these instruments available to those of you who are going to be providing the response over time. We've got to make sure there's enough funding available to make these services happen. And that's where you have to influence your political leads, your government, your local authorities at that level. You need to sort of get in and make a bid that the people affected by this tragic event require evidence-based help. And that can only be done with adequate funding to ensure that staff are trained and supported to make these treatments available. And you need this central organizational structure, because if you don't have that joined up thinking of all the different agencies, then what happens is after the acute aftermath, all the agencies start passing the responsibility to each other. After the Norway tragedy and the Utawa shootings, for example, between 5 and 15 months, 50% of the victims lost contact with services because of this diffusion of responsibility, so that people are no longer sure who they should be in touch with. So I just want to finish with this little slide, which is a sign of hope, and it's about post-traumatic growth. These awful tragedies happen in our world because alongside warmth and empathy and care and compassion, unfortunately, the negative side of human nature still prevails. Brutality, lack of empathy, all of these negative behaviors that flow from those human negative characteristics. But we should not allow those to outweigh our thinking, because in general terms, life can be beautiful. We have to try and cleanse it of all these negative human characteristics and behaviors, and we have to learn that it can be enjoyed to the full. And in Northern Ireland, after 30 years of conflict, we were able to dance again, we were able to enjoy music again, and you will do so in the future as well, beyond this awful tragedy. I wish you well in your endeavours.
Wow, Michael, this was a marathon, incredibly informative, honestly, so much, so many very important information. I can already see some feedback on chat, really, really very helpful.
Okay, very good. I hope it's useful.
And it's incredible that you, a person who comes from North Ireland, have really represented a country or part of the island that was so traumatized for so many years. And really that situation seemed at one point, I remember when I was going and visiting Northern Ireland, it seemed to be completely helpless and hopeless situation. And yet people have been able to overcome this trauma and start leading normal life and peaceful life and cooperate and be happy and enjoy life.
Yes.
So your country is really very symbolic for us, I hope, and for Ukraine as well. That even though it's so hard now, it's unbelievably hard, things will change and will change for good. So thank you
Yes.
very much.
My pleasure. And sure, you can let me know what the feedback's like when you get time. And I'll talk to you again soon.
We are constantly in touch, Michael. So thank you very much.
Look after yourself.
Have some rest. And thank you so much.
My
Thanks a
pleasure.
lot.
Bye-bye.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Bye.